Nearly 60% of people in England and Wales claim to be a Christian. That's some of the latest census figures, which are a few years out of date now, and the number's going down each year. But still, nearly 60% of people claim in this country to be a Christian. Is it true? Are 60% of people in Cwmbran, in Wales, in England and Wales, the UK, are they Christians? What even makes a Christian? What is a Christian? What's the difference between somebody who claims to be a Christian but who isn't a Christian and somebody who actually genuinely is a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? That's what we're going to be thinking a little bit about this morning in James chapter 2. What does it mean to truly be a Christian? Is anyone who claims to be a Christian truly a Christian? Well, today's passage in James 2 is challenging. It's challenging for us in a number of ways, as we'll see. It's also challenging in how it fits in with the rest of the New Testament. So if you've got a Bible, grab James chapter 2. James chapter 2 verse 24 says this: "You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone." That's what it says, James 2:24. The Apostle Paul in Romans 3:28 says, "We maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." So is there a contradiction here? Is it James that's saying, well, we are right with God by our works, and Paul is saying, no, we're right with God by our faith, not our works? Well, who's right? Is there a contradiction here in the Bible? Are James and Paul fighting against each other here? How do we understand that? Well, that's what this passage in James chapter 2 is about. So we're going to get stuck into it. Hopefully we'll see some answers at the end and we won't be too confused. We're going to see in this passage three types of faith. Three types of faith. The first type of faith is dead faith. Dead faith. First type of faith is dead faith. Look down at verse 14 of our passage in chapter 2, James. These are people who claim to be Christians. James 2. "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them?" This is somebody who claims to be a Christian, who says that they're a Christian, but they don't have any deeds. They don't actually live it out in any way. It makes no difference to their life whatsoever. They're just claiming the badge of being a Christian. And so James says, verse 14, can such a faith save them? Can they go to heaven? If you just claim to be a Christian, is that enough to get into heaven? It's a huge question, isn't it? And to answer it, he gives an example. Verse 15. "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it?" The example's pretty clear. It's a Christian brother or sister. That's what it means when it says a brother or a sister. A fellow Christian that has obvious physical needs, whether it's clothes or food or something like that. And if you say to them, "Well, I hope it works out for you, all the best," and don't do anything, does that help them, he says? What good is it? Verse 16. His conclusion is verse 17. "In the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, it's dead." In the same way that just having words doesn't actually prove any help to the person who needs physical help. In the same way, well, just having words, just claiming to be a Christian, but not actually doing anything, doesn't prove effective for salvation, James says. If we claim to be a Christian, but we don't live it out in any way, James says that's not saving faith. Now the example here is, I think, fairly straightforward, but let's put it into a sort of modern world. Imagine the scene. It's May. The weather's warm. Restrictions are falling away. We're back in church. This is optimistic, but just imagine. We're back in church. Loads of people have had their jabs. Restrictions have fallen away. We're having tea and coffee before the morning service. Do you remember a time we used to have tea and coffee? Do you remember that? Tea and coffee? People having tea and coffee, chatting, loads of people there, kids running, like the good old days. We're back in church. It may not be May, but at some stage that'll happen. And you're chatting. You're chatting to somebody, a fellow church member, somebody you've known for a while, who you know is a Christian, and you're chatting, and you can see they're a little bit down as you're having your cup of tea before the service. And as you get chatty, you try and draw them out a little bit, trying to see what the matter is. And they eventually tell you it's because they're between jobs at the moment and they're really struggling financially. Universal credit hasn't yet come in, and they're waiting for something from the food bank, but that's taking a while. The bills are piling up and they're feeling down. What would you say to that situation? Let's have a think in your mind. What would you say? What would you do? Would you say, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear about that. Oh, is that the time? I better be getting my seat. The service is about to start now. I'll take my cup and my mug to the hatch. I'll see you later." Would you respond like that to an obvious specific situation? I hope you wouldn't. I guess you probably wouldn't. Why? Because following Jesus, being a Christian, means that makes a difference in our lives. It affects things. It affects the way we think, the way that we feel, the way that we spend our money, the way that we spend our energy, our time, our effort. Following Jesus, being a Christian, changes us. It transforms us. We're different as a result. And I know that in our church, people do care about physical, practical needs. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus, James says. That's why, as a church, the elders have a fund that we sometimes give to people who have particular needs. I know that there have been people in the church who have wanted to give anonymously and have done it sort of through the elders. I know other people in the church who have volunteered to buy very specific things that people have needed for their house. They've done it because being a Christian makes a difference. It makes a difference to how we spend our money, how we spend our time, how we care about people, how we provide physically for people. It makes a difference. James says if we just claim to be a follower of Jesus and don't put any of that into practice, well, that means that actually our faith is dead. Now, practically speaking, for us as a church, it means that we need to be really good, first and foremost, about listening to needs. Listening to the needs that are already in the church. I'm talking to myself as much as anybody else here. But when we talk to people, perhaps on the phone, just being aware of the needs that people have. When we chat on Zoom or perhaps when we see people face to face, listening to the needs in prayer clusters, in life groups, as we speak with people. It may be something very simple like offering to give someone a lift to the hospital, or COVID rules dependent and all that, or paying for someone's taxi, or picking up just some bread and milk for someone who might need that, or doing people shopping for a while. Practical things that in and of themselves may not be huge for us to do, but for someone else that might be a massive thing. And James says that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Not to have dead faith, claiming something but then not living it out, but putting it into action. The point James is making in this first bit, if we claim to follow Jesus, if we claim to be a Christian, but our life is totally the same as everybody else in society, people, Joe Bloggs down the road who doesn't know Jesus at all, if our life is exactly the same, it perhaps means we don't have saving faith, we have dead faith. That's the first type of faith James is talking about here, dead faith, this claiming to be a Christian. The second type is demonic faith. Demonic faith. Look down at verse 18. Some will say, "You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I'll show you my faith by my deeds. You believe there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder." Now the issue here is slightly different. It's people who say that they know stuff to be true. They do sort of believe it to be true, but it has made no difference in their life again. People who intellectually assent to the truth, but it hasn't changed them. People who say, "Oh yeah, of course I believe that Jesus is the Son of God," and yet that seems to have made no difference to their lives at all. People who say, "Oh, of course, we're all sinners, aren't we?" and yet they never seem to confess their sin. Or they seem to be defensive about it. They seek no joy in knowing that their sins are forgiven. People who say, I believe this is true, and yet it seems to have made absolutely no difference to the way that they're living their lives day on day. That's what James is talking about here. And he says, actually, that type of thing, where we say that we believe it, but we haven't acted upon it in any way, that is what the demons are like. Look at what he says. He says, "You believe there is one God, good. It's good to believe there is one God. It's good to be monotheistic. We believe there's one God in 3 persons, Father, Son and Spirit. There's only one God. Good. Even the demons believe that, though. Satan and the demons, the fallen angels, they believe that God is one. They believe that there's only one God. They're monotheistic. They know that, but they've been kicked out of heaven by him. They know there's only one God. They believe that to be true. They know it's true. But they're not changed in a good way by that, are they? In fact, they shudder. They're terrified of God. They hate God. They're afraid of him. That's why you see in the Gospels, often people who are demon-possessed in the Gospels, how do they respond to Jesus? There's one of fear, terror. They're afraid. They shudder at the presence of God. But they believe he's there. They believe in God. Not enough to believe in God. Merely intellectually assenting to the truth. Merely sort of believing it in your head, but not living that out, is no better than the demons, James says. Now imagine, this is perhaps a strange thought experiment. Perhaps, Satan is being interviewed on the Andrew Marr show. It would be a strange guest for Andrew Marr to have, or perhaps he's had stranger. And he's interviewing Satan, and Satan is the father of lies, Jesus says. So he probably would be lying. But imagine, Andrew Marr's trying to get a straight answer out of him. And Andrew Marr's, cutting across him as they do in these interviews, and he says, do you believe, Satan, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Do you believe that he died on the cross? Do you believe that he rose again on the 3rd day? Do you believe that he's seated at the right hand of the Father and he's coming again in glory to judge the living and the dead? Do you believe those things to be true, Satan? If he was giving an honest answer, how would he answer? He does believe those things to be true. They are true. He knows them. And he hates them. The point is, just intellectually believing it to be true is not enough. It's the minimum. I'm not saying we shouldn't intellectually believe those things to be true. We ought to. We ought to believe them and act upon them. Have our lives transformed by those truths. Something, of course, that the demons do not have. They do not have lives transformed by the truth. That's the point. Demonic faith. Just merely intellectually believing it, but not living it out. James says that's not enough. It's not saving faith. So we've had dead faith, demonic faith. The third one, dynamic faith. A real living dynamic faith. And here at this point, James wants to give us 2 examples. 2 examples for us of people who had real living dynamic faith. The first is Abraham. Abraham, verse 21. Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God. It was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. James says Abraham, 2,000 years ago, before James was writing, 2,000 years before James, he says Abraham was a man who didn't just claim to be a follower of God, didn't just claim allegiance to God, didn't just sort of intellectually believe it up there. He lived it out. He put it into practice. His life was transformed by God. He was an example of a man who had living faith, real faith, saving faith, dynamic faith, you might say. Abraham is an example. But this is where we get to the bit that is perhaps a bit controversial. Is there a contradiction here? Look at verse 21 again. He's considered righteous for what? Well, when he did something, he offered up his son Isaac on the altar. Genesis 22. Verse 24, the summary of it is, a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. Now, if you've been part of our church for any length of time, hopefully you will have heard that being saved, being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus is about grace, about what's been done for us by God sending his son Jesus to die on the cross. It's about faith. Salvation is by faith, trusting, believing in that promise, receiving that promise for ourselves. The Apostle Paul says we're saved not by works of the law, but by faith. And yet James here seems to be saying the opposite. We're saved by the things that we do and not just by our faith. Is there a contradiction here? How do we sort of reconcile these things? Well, I think the answer, the solution, is in verse 23. Scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. You might have a little footnote at that point. I do in my Bible. And that says, that is a quote from Genesis 15, verse 6. Now, the story here is God says to Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. Go out your house, look up. So he looks up. He's sort of numbering them all. And he believes God's promise. Sees all the stars in the sky and he believes God's promise. And that faith, that trust of God's promise is considered by God as righteousness. God gives him a righteous status before him, that he's right before God because of his trust in God. That's Genesis 15. Now, verse 21 of our passage talked about a time when Abraham offered his son Isaac up on the altar. If you know that story, that's Genesis 22. That's significant. I'm not very good at maths, as this week's homeschooling has indicated, but I know that if I was counting from 0 to 22, that 15 comes before 22 and not after 22. That's a correct statement. The point is, Abraham was counted righteous in chapter 15 by faith. Not in chapter 22, when he demonstrated that faith. He was already righteous by the time he got to chapter 22. The point is, Abraham showed his faith. He demonstrated his faith. He lived it out in chapter 22, a faith that he already had, a righteous status that he already had in chapter 15. We are saved by grace alone, by faith. There is no contradiction here. What James is saying, James knows that in verse 23. What James is saying is Abraham showed that real faith. He showed that dynamic faith by putting it into action, by living it out. And that's what he did when he trusted God in Genesis 22 with offering up his son Isaac. In other words, Abraham is somebody who believed God's promises and then lived them out. He put it into practice. The other example, that's the first example. The other example is Rahab, a very different type of example. Verse 25. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodgings to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? Now, the story here is Rahab, who is an outcast, as James reminds us in verse 25. She gave lodging to some spies, some Israelite spies in the Old Testament, and then she hid them on the roof. And so when people were looking for them, were looking to kill them, she hid them on the roof, and then she sent them in a different direction. She saved their lives. The point James is making is she was righteous. She lived out her faith. She obviously had a faith, trusted God's promise. How she heard about him, we don't really know. She believed in that, and she put it into action. She did something about it. In fact, a very dangerous thing that she did. Her life was at risk for doing that. She's very brave. James is saying she lived out her faith. She wasn't somebody who just claimed allegiance or intellectually believed it. No, she put it into practice. It made a difference in her life. And the summary, of course, in all that James is saying, verse 26, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. It's dead faith to be claiming allegiance, just merely believing it to be true and not putting it into practice. It is not saving faith. Ultimately, that's the serious thing. It is not saving faith. It will not bring us into heaven. The faith that will bring us into heaven is by believing it to be true and living it out, putting it into practice, allowing it to transform us by God's grace. And so as we close, really, whoever you are, whether you're somebody who's been to church many times, who would consider themselves religious, perhaps like Abraham, a famous religious figure, he was saved by faith, a faith that was transformed in his life, that he lived out his faith. Also, Rahab is the opposite end of the spectrum from Abraham, I think it's fair to say. An outcast woman. I mean, her job would have meant she was an outcast. And yet, how was she made right with God? By faith, and she lived it out. She is an example to us. Be like Rahab. Be like Abraham. Live out your faith. And if you do, the wonderful thing is, verse 23, we can be called God's friend. Abraham believed God and was called God's friend. Do you want to be friends with God? Do you want to be known as God's friend? Brian, God's friend. That sounds good, doesn't it? You can put your own name. Don't say Brian unless your name is Brian. Put your own name in. God's friend. You can be God's friend by receiving the promise, by believing God's promises. It's credited as righteousness, and living that out. Put it into practice. And we can be God's friend. So whoever we are, whatever background we're from, whatever we've been up to in the past, we can have the knowledge, the safety, the hope that if we put our trust in God, we are His. And the challenge, of course, for all of us is not to be people who merely claim it to be true, but who put it into practice. Sometimes it's costly. Sometimes it's difficult. But James says that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So we've seen there are three types of faith. Dead faith, demonic faith. But if we receive Jesus, if we live it out, put it into practice, allow Him to transform our hearts, we can have dynamic faith.